gender as well as species models that contribute to discrimination and exploitation. And while the Hooters for Neuters campaign, as well as the other campaigns mentioned here, claim to promote animal rights, and they certainly do produce some positive material change that I do not wish to entirely discount, they also simultaneously reinforce highly troubling, archaic narratives surrounding gender, race, and other social locations. Issues surrounding masculinity as well as class, in conversation with the politics of spaying and neutering, become further tangible when one considers the existence of nudicles, which are hormone-free artificial silicone testicles produced for companion species. They come in a range of sizes and cost anywhere from $150 a pair to over $500. Using the campaign slogan, "It's like nothing ever changed," they act as a stand-in for the real thing in our ocular-centric, product-obsessed capitalist culture, and their popularity continues to grow every year. A man who purchased the product for his family's pet dog claimed nudicles let the poor dog keep his dignity after neutering. And they were even featured in an episode of Keeping Up with the Kardashians when Bruce Jenner purchased them for Kim's dog, Rocky, in an effort to assure the dog's masculinity was retained following surgery. The examples that I have explored here, including the conversation that I overheard and interpreted in my ethnographic field notes, the various spay and neuter campaigns, and the surgical implants, nudicles, demonstrate how humans imprint oftentimes stereotypical, hierarchically drenched meanings onto the animal others that they interact with in their daily lives. How and why those gendered as well as racialized, class, and sexualized stereotypes develop has real lived implications on the interreliant lives of humans and non-human animals. These examples also demonstrate that the seemingly simple question, to neuter or not to neuter, that appears on the surface to exist in the realm of the biological of nature, quickly reveals itself as a space where Harawaiian notions of nature culture materially and discursively manifest. And it is in this space that we come to see that in feminism and feminist scholarship, to quote Donna Haraway, the category work of gender is never alone. Instead, it is complexly, reciprocally implicated with other social locations, including race, class, nationality, sexuality, and even species. For in exploring the entangled situatedness of these categories while simultaneously working to destabilize the nature, culture, and human-non-human dichotomies, as well as other problematic and limiting dualisms, one comes to see that there always exist many layers, further knots that need to be disentangled. Thank you.
So Meredith, we're going to go right into questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, I can barely hear you, but
Okay.
I'm going to do my best.
All right. Questions from Meredith.
Well, I got one. Meredith, I don't think you can see me, but that's okay. Actually, I'll turn this. Hey, friend. Hey, so I've actually never asked if you look at the way that nudicles are discussed among vets. So
I have interviews with vets, yeah, and a lot of them say that it's worth it to them to implant them as long as if that allows the animal to be neutered.
Okay.
So that's the general narrative among vets, is that they think that they're unnecessary and silly, but they don't hurt the animal, and they encourage owners to neuter.
Awesome. All right, thank you.
I'll ask a question. Oh, please.
No,
No, you go first. No, I insist.
Oh, okay. I'm still formulating how to ask this question. But how do you think the neuterization of animals fits into, like, and owners, I guess, their resistance against... Oh, can you hear me?
Not very well.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. Very close there. Maybe I can formulate it a little better. All right, so I was wondering how, I was wondering how you thought the resistance that pet owners have, primarily males, with their ideas of masculinity, how that idea of losing masculinity with the removal or the neuterization of their dogs, how that fits into like rape culture. I don't know if you think it does or, yeah.
I can't say that I've really explored that, but that's a really interesting thought. There's definitely a discussion of virility, but I have not heard them discuss consent outside of, like, they feel like they don't have their individual dog's consent to remove their testicles. That's the only time consent has come up. But I've not heard any reference to rape, and I haven't brought in sexual violence into conversation with this. However, it's, it is right below the surface when discussing hegemonic masculinity, I think.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
I have a question. Have you found any thought about like discourses of like spaying instead of neutering? I know that there's not virility necessarily in that, but I'm interested in like the conversations that might be surrounding that.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in spaying too. There are so many fewer narratives about spaying, particularly in the campaigns. Like, I have not really seen an explicit link of socially constructed femininity in the spaying of companion species, which is interesting. The only narrative that sort of exists, and it's a weak one, in the interviews that I've done, are that a non-spayed female is more loyal and to her person, and so that could be read as sort of protecting the home, protecting loved ones, like caregiving, but it's a weak narrative, and I don't really see it in the advertisements, but it is present in the interviews to a certain degree.
Hello. One question I have is whether or not you've looked at how this compares with discourses in human vasectomies, and especially given like the physiological differences between a vasectomy and castration, and yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I definitely see parallels in the discourse, even though, like, materially, yeah, they are extremely different, like between castration and a vasectomy, but I think the narratives are similar in terms of, fear of shooting blanks as a sort of consistent virility-enforced narrative among men.
I guess I just have a comment that, in this like threat to virility where hooters for neuters, so you're so worried about your own virility because the dog that is your companion is losing testicles, that you go to like this location and site, right, of the fortification of like retro masculinity, which is hooters, as this is happening to your dog, which you're so concerned about, but the free chicken wings seem to be enough to like reinforce this weird masculinity. So I'm sorry, it's not a question, but that's all I wanted to say.
Hooters for Neuters is a really strange campaign. It's very popular.
Yeah.
And yeah, the free chicken wings seem to get people in there.
Yeah.
They can overcome their fear of emasculation if they're reinforcing their masculinity while their dog is being emasculated. And I don't want to, like I said in the paper, I don't want to completely discount the real material benefits that these campaigns have. I mean, they're getting people, to engage in the system. They're often like raising funds and helping with cost, and so that's a big deal. But it does seem rather unfortunate that it has to fall to sexism and reinforcing these problematic discussions.
All right.
Any other questions?
No, thank you, Meredith.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
fish panics. And Lauren is a doctoral student in the Department of Gender, Women and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington, working at the intersection of trans studies, critical animal studies, queer theory, and eco-feminist thought. Lauren is a member of the UW Critical Animal Studies Working Group and the UW Postcolonial Animal Research Cluster. So, welcome.
Thanks. So I think for some reason, I've never had this happen, but it's cropping part of my lead. So we're just going to go with it anyway. So if you can't read something, just ask me what it is, but I don't really want to delay this anymore than it. So the paper that I'm presenting is called Unsexing the Animal, Thinking Critically About Intersex Fish Panics. And Unsexing the Animal is a play on words that I realize maybe not is everyone is getting, because there's this book called Sexing the Body, which was written by Anne Foster Sterling, about how the norms of physical sex as dimorphic are arguably constructed anyway. So I'll get more into that, but just know there was an attempt at a pun. So I actually want to start off with the bald eagle. So the bald eagle has been a symbol of pride and prowess since it was adopted as a national mascot in 1782. Embossed on the official U.S. seal as well as on dollar bills and quarters, the bald eagle supposedly stands for everything quote-unquote American. An unusually solitary animal, the bald eagle is an emblem of the independence and masculinity that our rugged forefathers felt as they quote-unquote discovered North America. Rugged creature that it was, though, the bald eagle was nonetheless placed on the endangered species list in 1967 thanks to DDT, a major endocrine disruptor used in the mid-20th century. So bald eagles were consuming fish containing high levels of this organic chloride found in insecticides, rendering some bald eagles infertile and others so calcium deficient that their eggs were too brittle to function. Although bald eagles have been since removed from the endangered species list, this is one example of the material and cultural threats that endocrine disruptors have had on the nation. It demonstrates the biopolitical reality that we've historically prioritized the futures of only certain species, in this case the national mascot, rather than the fish who were more directly exposed to DDT in the first place. That continues to be true today. So in this paper, I'd like to shift the focus to the often invisible animals such as fish and frogs. But let me first give a quick background on endocrine disruptors so we're all on the same page. So from the way that endocrine disruptors have been discussed in the news and books since the 1990s, one might presume that they're a new discovery. However, information about the estrogenic effects of natural and synthetic compounds has been well established in the US and as early as the 1930s. And some argue that ancient civilizations were aware of the effects of various herbal preparations and what we now know to be hormonal processes. Endocrine disruptors, which can be either natural or man-made, are known to interfere with the body's endocrine system and can have adverse effects on the developmental, reproductive, neurological, and immune system in both humans and non-human animals. The emphasis, however, is disproportionately on man-made endocrine disruptors, a process that draws on fears of eco-catastrophe emerging from this futuristic outside, rather than ironically from the hormones that our own bodies are producing that we're excreting. Much attention goes to the synthetic endocrine disruptors, including bisphenol A, BPA, which has gotten a lot of coverage in the last few years, phthalates in plastic wrap made from PVC, food containers and children's toys, and estrogen supplements for hormone replacement therapy, or those used in birth control pills. So just a general kind of overview of what this is looking at. So I'm placing temporality studies, how we're conceiving of time, and feminist environmental studies in conversation with critical animal studies. And I contend that in our discussion of environmental futures, we're engaging in unique temporalities with human and non-human animals that have a simultaneous potential to reinforce and unravel the human-animal divide, as well as to think more clearly about norms about sex, sexuality, gender, and ability in both humans and non-human animals. So temporality is fundamental to thinking about queer ecologies because it is always at play, whether we attend to it or not. So Elizabeth Freeman writes in her book Time Binds, people are bound to one another in groups, made to feel coherently collective through particular orchestrations of time, end quote. While collectivity can be positive, the temporalities marking the way we discuss toxicity can be quite violent. attending to the ways power functions in our conceptualizations of ecological crisis gives us the opportunity to rework them. So in this work, I trace several intertwined temporalities in intersex panics, what I call anxious time. So that is looking nostalgically to the past and anxiously to the future at once. Reproductive futurism, which is fixating on the longevity of our species, which I adapt from Lee Edelman. And evolutionary time, which is subjugating non-human animals in time to protect our own futures, and which I adapt from Stacy Lamo. So I'll address these more in detail later. So to start off, in examining how these temporalities operate, I'd like to turn to a TED Talk entitled The Toxic Baby, presented by researcher Tyrone Hayes and filmmaker Penelope Jagisar-Schaefer in 2010. So in this lecture, Hayes and Schaefer discuss the dangers of exposing children to common chemicals and pesticides. Within the first 60 seconds, Schaefer invokes anxious time. She bemoans the fact that we have had between 30 to 50,000 chemicals in our bodies that our grandparents didn't have, many of which are linked to childhood illness. In doing so, Schaefer refers to this mythical prelapsarian time before the advent of endocrine disruptors. Here, however, Schaefer obscures the fact that estrogenic compounds are normally produced and excreted by human and non-human animals. Hayes also moves through anxious time when he articulates apprehension about the mass extinction of amphibians. He notes, quote, that we're losing species from the earth faster than the dinosaurs disappeared. And he argues that pesticides such as atrazine are the cause. At the same time, he deploys reproductive futurism when he bemoans the intersex conditions these frogs develop and how these threaten frogs' reproductive futures. So I really briefly want to show you a clip because there's no way I could attempt to articulate what's going on here. It's too much to put into words. Let's see if this...
Water. In 2003, after my studies, it was banned.
Okay, so this is Tyrone Hayes. He does research on atrazine, which is a pesticide that's commonly used. And so he looks at the effects of atrazine on frogs.
Water. In 2003, after my studies, it was banned in the European Union, but in that same year, the United States EPA re-registered the compound. We were a bit surprised when we found out that when we exposed frogs to very low levels of atrazine, 0.1 parts per billion, that it produced animals that look like this. These are the dissected gonads of an animal that has 2 testes, 2 ovaries, another large testis, more ovaries, which is not normal, even for amphibians. In some cases, another species like the North American leopard frog, which showed that males exposed to atrazine grew eggs in their testes, and you can see these large yolked-up eggs bursting through the surface of this male's testes. Now, my wife tells me, and I'm sure Penelope can as well, that there's nothing more painful than childbirth, which, that I'll never experience it, I can't really argue that, but I would guess that a dozen chicken eggs in my testicle would probably be somewhere in the top 5.
Okay, I could let it go for quite a while. It doesn't like stop. So by pairing all of this with his fear about losing frog populations, Hayes is framing intersex as a pathology. That's pretty clear. He's marking it as this marker of eco-catastrophe. By framing concerns about estrogenic compounds in terms of endangering babies, which Schaefer does earlier in the talk, Schaefer and Hayes not only depict endocrine disruptors as a more serious threat, after all they're endangering the most helpless of beings, but they articulate environmental concerns in a specifically reproductive time that reinforces the importance of biological reproduction. So Lee Edelman has argued that political campaigns often use protecting babies as a central argument because it's impossible to refuse and thus usually on the winning side in some degree. However, there's an important way that temporality plays into the specifically human-animal interface here. It seems quite odd that in order to talk about the health of human babies, we should turn to frogs. And even Schaefer notes that the work that they're doing together, they find to be quite odd. Like many other environmentalists, Hayes articulates frogs as are good indicators and are, quote, more sensitive because they have no protection in the water, no eggshells, no membranes, and no placenta, end quote. So I contend that Hayes deploys evolutionary time when he situates frogs in a distant past and describes the placenta as an ancient structure that separates us from other animals like amphibians. By articulating the differences between mammals and amphibians were determined long ago, Hayes situates our fishy companions as existing in a different time than us, as permanently pre-human, as if they ceased to evolve with us and only evolved into us. So these scientific discourses pathologizing intersex animals exposed to endocrine disruptors move beyond the mere basic process of articulating concern about intersex bodies. They discuss these fish, frogs, and alligators as quote-unquote freaky and mutant. They're preoccupied with the potentially decreasing sperm count of human males globally, and they express anxiety about decreasing male births based on chemical exposure. They reify a pastoral utopia of the past, this time before the advent of estrogenic compounds. Estrogenic compounds, though, as I've alluded to a number of times already in this presentation, are excreted naturally by both humans and non-human animals. One of the major hormones used in hormone replacement therapy is actually derived from the urine of pregnant mares, just because it's so high in estrogen. It should not be surprising then that researchers have found that one of the major sources of endocrine disruption is actually agricultural runoff and human sewage systems. So we keep framing it as this thing that's coming from these chemicals gone haywire, but the answer might actually be right under our noses. So here again, we're seeing the way endocrine disruption is seen as a problem emerging from outside. So operating in anxious time here means articulating concerns and compunctions about the present in fear of enacting potentially queer and non-normative futures. Specifically in writing about the fears of increasing frequency of intersex births, researchers, journalists, and concerned consumers operate in anxious time where the present is only relevant in as much as it predicts the future where humans fail to approximate the norm of dimorphic sex. Intersex, however, is not a new phenomenon. Has been in existence long before endocrine disruptors. There are tons of people who can speak to this, but Barman et al. Is one source. These discourses stir panic about the discovery of certain intersex animals without contextualizing that there are many exclusively hermaphroditic species. I can talk about the difference between hermaphrodism and intersex in Q&A if you want, but they're connected. And that dimorphic sex in humans is often constructed. So these are pretty important things to overlook. Moreover, in equating normative physical sex with reproduction, news articles have articulated anxiety by talking about how endocrine disruptors put frogs in the gender blender, create Mr. Moms, where chemically castrated guys develop into egg-laying gals, end quote. So by describing fish and frogs as quote-unquote gender bending and being put in the gender blender, the authors indicate on the one hand conflation of sex and gender, sex being biological and gender being social identity, and secondly they articulate a limited male-female binary understanding of sex and gender. Moreover, by conflating sex and gender, they express phobias about they extend phobias about intersex to broader queer and trans phobias. After all, many trans folks identify as bigender, genderqueer, genderfuck, or gender fluid, all of which are implicitly pathologized here in a discussion that's actually not about how fish are presented in genders. In an effort to protect future human populations, we fixate on physical sex as it relates to capabilities of reproduction, the most basic biological capability of being alive, or so we assert. We focus on our ability to sustain our own lineages and our species as a whole. So Halberstam writes, quote, "We create longevity as the most desirable future, applaud the pursuit of long life under any circumstances, and pathologize modes of living that show little to no concern for longevity," end quote. Not yet. By focusing so heavily on sex variation, though, we end up obscuring other health problems associated with endocrine disruptors. For instance, breast, ovarian, prostate, and testicular cancers, neurological and neurobehavioral problems, immune system breakdown, heart disease, diabetes, and obesity. We risk overlooking other conditions of well-being, such as mental and physical health, conditions that affect the livelihood of a person in the present, as a being in the present moment, rather than a creator of the future. So as with all human-animal relations, of course, there's an intimate trans-species temporality at play in these discourses that use other animals as a proxy for human futures. So we see ourselves in the fish that we study because we share a number of characteristics with fish. We even have gills in the womb. There's currently a show on Netflix called Your Inner Fish, which talks about the connection that we have with fish. So because we're looking through the lens of evolutionary time with animals, we can see in a single fish or frog the expansive history we share with them and focus on our shared commonalities rather than our fleshy differences. But evolutionary time is just as forward-looking as it is backward-looking. By using these fish as environmental sentinels to predict our future livelihoods, we articulate fear that their development of intersex characteristics may mean that we too are approaching sex-unstable futures. By seeing an intersex fish and asking, could I be next, as many news sources have done, we reinscribe human as priority and as distinctly different from other animals because we presume that the non-human is somehow acted upon first before the human. Here we apply a kind of allochronism, or what is anthropologically discussed as the denial of the simultaneous existence of the observer and the observed, by placing the observed in past time. Transspecies temporalities do not, of course, merely exist at the site of ecological panics. The relegating of time to animals is a biopolitical process. Those animals that are deemed worthy and breathable lives are given a futurity and a history. On the other hand, we have cows and steers in concentrated animal feeding operations whose estrogen-filled fecal runoff permeates the Chesapeake Bay, even though they're suspected to be a major cause. Yet we focus not on the futures of these commodified farm animals. Instead, we focus on sea life specifically because they're environmental sentinels. So we care about the livelihoods of cows and steers with the emergence of bovine spongiform encephalopathy known as mad cow, not in as much as it threatened the future health of cattle, but rather because it threatened our own futures. So by articulating endocrine disruptors and related increases of illness to a linear timeline of pre-endocrine disruptors, current risks, and potentially debilitating non-normative futures, people such as Schaefer and Hayes ultimately mobilize anxious time as an argument for increased self-governance over which products to consume in order to protect ourselves and our environment. So because the USA has not yet banned BPA products outright, we're left merely waiting for legal regulatory changes from federal institutions in the US. And a major piece of legislation that environmentalists are placing hope in is the Clean Water Act. I'll abridge my conversation here. But ultimately, the Clean Water Act works to protect wetlands, mainly water treatment facilities, but it allows pollution from agricultural operations if the agriculture entity really receives a permit from the state. Again, this kind of reinforces the idea of sustainable CAFO. The other major law that environmentalists are turning to is the Toxic Substances Control Act, which has recently gained news coverage as we're discussing an updated version. In all of this, environmental organizations and concerned consumers use non-normative bodies, both human and non-human, as monstrous in order to support legislation that ultimately obscures animal harm and major causes of endocrine disruption in the first place. But these pieces of legislation have even greater limitations because they're not looking critically at the different ways that environmental destruction intersects with other systems of oppression. After all, as we know, concentrated animal feeding operations are often located in low-income communities, often a high percentage of whom are people of color, many of whom actually work at these facilities. All the while, environmentalists argue that we must wait for knowledge to spread about the harmfulness of seemingly innocuous chemicals, such as those in prescription medications, for instance. In the meanwhile, Schaefer implies, the onus is upon us to inform ourselves of the number of chemicals we're exposed to on a daily basis. Ultimately, an inability to inform oneself of the toxic chemicals in the environment means one becomes personally responsible for the negative effects of endocrine disruptors. And even in the best cases, these environmental efforts ignore the question of whole species. So, but rather than turning to rights-based discourses which seek to reify the liberal subject, in this case the intersex human or the intersex non-human animal, I think we first need to turn to what Anat Pick would call our shared creatureliness. Not as rights-bearing subjects, but as precarious fleshy inhabitants of the same planet. An updated version of Butler's precarity work, Creaturely Poetics, helped to demonstrate our proximities with non-human animals. What would it mean to look to the lived experience of a frog with typically male anatomy who also has eggs in his testes, as Hayes starts to do? How might the process of removing this frog from his habitat and quote-unquote humanely slicing open his testes be a refusal of our shared creatureliness? So in order to think about what ecological justice might look like, I propose imaginative time as a political methodology. Here I draw upon Nicole Seymour's work, where she describes imagination. Imagination has great resonance for queer ecology, since humans cannot always see the consequences of their actions on the environment immediately. nor the intricate interrelationships among all components in an ecosystem. They must be able to imagine them in order to act empathetically and ethically. So imagining the livelihoods of non-human animals is indeed one of the first steps to articulating creaturely eco-justice. So let's look back to that TED Talk for a moment briefly to see how imaginative time might work. So after Tyrone Hayes chuckles about the bizarreness of intersex frogs' gonadal makeup, he makes what I find to be the more interesting joke. And you can tell me whether you agree with this reading or not. So he says, "My wife tells me there's nothing more painful than childbirth, but I would guess that a dozen chicken eggs in my testicle would probably be somewhere in the top 5. So the temporality of the would-be, the realm of the imagined, can, as we've seen, operate as a violent, anxious time, but it also has the potential to be a mode of resistance. By exaggerating the frog's potential discomfort, by comparing frog eggs and frog testes to the large chicken eggs in a human testicle, Hayes is making an absurd comparison. Instead of saying something like, it might be uncomfortable to have human eggs in my testes, which are quite small by comparison, Hayes is rendering the scenario monstrous in both its size and its chimerism. We can read Hayes' exaggeration as having the potential to evoke discomfort on the part of the viewer to potentially imagine what toxicity might feel like for a frog. Although problematic, given in its conflation of intersex and toxicity, it could also be read as a step towards developing more complex interspecies intimacies. What is even clearer, though, is that this whole discussion is a digression from Hayes' main argument about reproductive futurism. If the frog whose gonads projected on the screen is merely an indicator for our forthcoming increase in frequency of intersex physiologies in humans, then what does the livelihood of the frogs even matter in the first place? How is this momentary imagining related to the fast-spreading mass extinction of frogs that he's concerned about in the rest of his presentation? So through his hinting at the sentience of animals, I argue that he's slowing down time, temporarily pausing the urgency of reproductive futurism in the face of mass extinction. Instead of fully inhabiting anxious time, Hayes briefly deploys imaginative time, a temporality that has the potential to rework our understandings of human-animal intimacies. So, as we've seen over the course of this paper, toxicity discourses move through anxious time, reproductive futurism, and evolutionary time as they use intersex animals as a proxy for humans. In looking to imaginative time as an alternative, though, I urge us to avoid turning to rights-based discourses, which, again, reify the liberal subject. I instead am proposing creatureliness as a way to think about our precarious fleshy inhabitants with other animals, and ask, how can we critically examine the toxic and destructive effects we're having on our ecosystems, while also recognizing that failing the stable sex and reproductive norms can be a form of resistance. Ultimately, we must recognize that ecological justice relies upon the health of all beings, not just normative ones, of whom there are arguably none anyway. So, thank you. Questions, concerns?
Well, I guess this is a question that you put out there earlier, but can you go into the difference between hermaphroditism and intersex?
Yep.
Because I have no idea.
Yeah, so the terms are used in, they're often conflated.
Yeah.
Hermaphroditism is quite rare in that it requires the presence of two sets of fully functioning reproductive structures, so both male and female, whereas intersex can be any variation in between. And so hermaphroditism is outdated. Does that help? So, other questions?
I'm wondering, I really enjoyed the term shared creatureliness. Sorry, did I miss that? Is that a term that you came up with? Or
I wish.
Yeah.
No, so Anat Pick, who's written about creaturely poetics, she's coined this term, and I think it does interesting work that things like precarity haven't done.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's a really useful starting point.
Yeah, yeah. Because there's so much problematic language.
Great.
You're just pointing out, this is something I haven't heard, a term I haven't heard before.
Yeah.
I'm really interested.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely found her work useful, so.
Just as a comment, like, and you kind of got at this a little bit, but one of the things that comes to my mind is in thinking through this shared creatureliness, like the fact that Hayes brings up childbirth is one of those moments where humans are very necessarily in that animal creature form, right? And that we, like, it's one of the moments that we're least able to quote unquote transcend our animality. And so I wonder if, like, I don't know.
See, that's interesting because I think, I would argue that by reducing animality to our reproduction, we're just furthering like reproductive futurism. Like, even though it's a shared phenomenon, I think the fact that we always go back to it as this primal, the essence of who we are, like all creatures share this, it can also be violent. So, yeah. Not to shut that down, but
Shut it down.
yeah.
Could you go back, so I can't remember where, but you were talking about sort of a fear of obesity.
Right, and I don't think I have that on a slide.
But I'm just wondering if you think there's room for critical disabilities critique.
Yes, totally.
There, and if so, could you suggest it further?
Yeah, absolutely. So I also do work I've also done some work with eco-ability here. So I think that, ability is so co-constituted in these discourses just because these fish and frogs don't just come up in terms of intersex. The next thing that comes up is that, they have some kind of mutant limb or mutant spores or something. So these are the two things that we always come back to. And so ability is so co-constructed. And so when other queer ecologists like Giovanna De Chiro, so she points out that our focusing on reproduction is problematic because we're not looking at these other things like cancer and obesity and all these things. And that's totally problematic, right? I think, or that's what I'm understanding that you're hinting at, right? And so I think it's important to assess overall, like the point of my work isn't to say like endocrine disruptors aren't bad, this is all a joke, like let's go home, climate change isn't real, like that's not the point. And so I think highlighting what the possible effects are of endocrine disruptors means that we can engage in new ways with them, and by only focusing on certain relationships that we have with endocrine disruptors and obscuring others, that's problematic.
Question.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in the quote that you used from Halberstam about like prioritizing the pursuit of a long life and pathologizing modes of living that show little or no concern for longevity. And I'm also interested in like kind of complicating like a politics of life that I think a lot of social movements use. And I'm wondering like if you could speak a little bit about like complicating that and challenging that in terms of like critical animal studies and anti-speciesist activists.
So in terms of complicating longevity, could you say a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm just wondering how you might see like anti-speciesist activism as perpetuating like a politics of life and what the implications of that might be. It's not like I'm like very, very new to this sort of like new conceptions of social movements beyond that sort of thinking. So I'm just
Right. So I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're asking how like animal justice and anti-speciesist organizations are taking up notions of politics of life,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
And how we're framing that. So I think, I think longevity comes up so much in thinking about fostering long-term human-animal care abilities we have to build long-term relationships with other animals, and longevity is so much wrapped up in that. But I think it's You know, it's a good question. I'm pausing. I don't know. You've asked me a good question.
Oh, thank you. I mean, one thing that just comes up for me is like saying, is it better to make the cages and slaughter in factory farms bigger so that animals can have a better, longer life there, or putting them in quote unquote humane farms so that they can have a slightly longer life before they're sent to slaughter. Those are some more obvious examples to me, but I'm wondering if you thought about more nuanced.
Right. So I think the length of life is super important here. And since I'm looking primarily at environmental discourses and how they're framing the animal, I can speak less to questions of that. But I can see, we talk a great deal about lengthening the lives of animals, like you said. But I think there's also really important politics of euthanasia that also come up, because there are tons of animal sanctuaries that also see euthanasia as a humane alternative. And what does it mean to when is a life complete? What does longevity look like for an animal who was euthanized? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So more questions.
All right. Thank you so much. We ended about 20 minutes early, so you can go practice some self-care, either in taking a break or in going to check out the panel, whatever you like.
That's a good question.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we do you know Professor Secret like that? Sure. Yeah, I'm one of my but I typically I won't be a surgery. And last semester we read a book about the last. Yeah, I started politics at Gandhi last night, but my brain is just really tired. And Gandhi was talking about kind of taking one's own life as an exercise of agency, self-regulation, for example. Whereas that completely flies in the face of the politics of life. Right. So I've been and the last the last paper that I wrote for review was kind of critically thinking about the dominant discourses within veganism and animal rights, and how they kind of perpetuate all sorts of colonialist discourses. Right. Which is also something I'm thinking about playing next year. But so yeah, that's where that question comes from.
Was this your PhD or?
This is just my master's work right now, but it'll probably be incorporated.
Okay. Is it going to be published?
Hopefully. Hopefully. Yeah. Let me just give you my card.
Sure.
I can send you the digital version. I was gonna ask, where do you guys?
You mentioned stuff around your theory and ecofeminism and animals as subjects and so forth.
Yeah.
But your presentation is one of the most theoretically rich I've seen in this vein. So I was wondering if you could think of
Yeah, please.
That'd be great.
Yeah, cool. I'd love to hear more about your work.
I would love to tell you about it.
Yeah.
I can give you my card too. Everyone's so prepared. It's just exciting to have something to use the cards for. Yeah, right.
Lauren, did you say that you also did post-colonial studies at Washington?
Yeah, I worked with Anais Swami, who does a lot of
yeah.
So it was sort of, it wasn't specifically in my thesis. I got cards printed a year ago and I handed out 3 of them.
Yeah, exactly. We'll give them to us in September. It just seems so huge.
They were great as well to
huge stack.
be able to
Oh, yeah.
save it and
Use that.
something
I can't just give it to me.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Keep it in mind.
Yes.
More to come.
Right. That's my novel.
Yeah.
Well done. Thank you. Yes, I do.
Will you please say hi for me?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm ready for bed.
No, it was not like, it wasn't that at all.
Okay, good. I was just like, usually I have answers for questions, but I was just like,
I feel like this group was like very, like, chill. I don't think anyone was at all trying to like sabotage you or, and like people are okay and you say, well, I'm actually down. We agree on that,
right,
which I think is a fully acceptable answer.
right. I really liked your question though. It makes me think. Which one? The one I shot on.
I hadn't really like thought through it. It popped into my head and I opened my mouth. So
No, it's
I'm glad you had a
It's
response
useful.
to it.
It's useful. So do we have to, are you going to the list? Yeah. Really quick.
There's something that really spoke to me.
Yeah.
Legal subject areas. And then companion animals, protein ethics, which the title sounds interesting, but then the talks sound more legally. Seems weird that they put like the two law things at the same time.
Well, the call for paper is this law.
For which one?
For this whole conference.
Oh.
That's why, like, we have law in our thing, and that's why I, like, briefly said something about laws, because that was my whole abstract.
No, I didn't even pay any attention to that whatsoever.
I might go to companion animals. Donna is an Egyptian drink manufacturer. Sounds interesting, doesn't it?
Yeah, no. I felt so much better in this
Yeah.
space. I feel like, okay, we found our peeps.
Before we would leave, as soon as she started talking, and I was just like, oh my god.
So rude. I actually thought, this is the first session I've been to where I thought all three talks were great.
Good, yeah, I really like their talks too. And I don't understand a lot. Yeah. Should not be around all of the other things intersections is important.
That should
Or
not
like
be around.
critiquing you. I don't know. I mean, like, it's great that you can have like discussions about it, but it's kind of, yeah, you know?
What, she just said that next year it's supposed to be post-colonial. Decolonialism. Do you know where it is next year?
Nope. Maybe it'll be in Seattle.
I would say, if it's a little closer to home, like,
It's
maybe
where the organizers are.
I'd give it a shot, especially like if it has a more interesting theme. But like, honestly,
Yeah, I'm gonna Skype it next year. Yeah.
hey,